So there is an introduction. Developer creating AI solutions with the Microsoft Foundry needs to work with the combination of services and software frameworks. The Microsoft Foundry SDK is designed to bring together common services and code libraries in a AI project through a central programmatic access point, making it easier for developers to write the code needed to build effective AI apps on Azure. In this module, you will learn how to use the Microsoft Foundry SDK to work with resources in an AI project.
What is the Microsoft Foundry SDK? 100 XP. 5 minutes. Microsoft Foundry provides a REST API that you can use to work with AI Foundry projects and the resources they contain. Additionally, multiple language-specific SDKs are available, enabling developers to write code that uses resources in a Microsoft Foundry project in their preferred development language. With a Microsoft Foundry SDK, developers can create applications that connect to a project, access the resource connections and models in that project, and use them to perform AI operations, such as sending prompts to a generative AI model and processing the responses. The core package for working with projects is the Azure AI Projects Library, which enables you to connect to a Microsoft Foundry project and access the resources defined within it. Available language-specific packages for Azure AI Projects Library include Azure AI Projects for Python, Azure AI Projects for Microsoft.NET, Azure AI Projects for JavaScript. Note: in this module, we'll use Python code examples for common tasks that a developer may need to perform with Microsoft Foundry projects. You can refer to the other language-specific SDK documentation to find equivalent code for your preferred language. Each SDK is developed and maintained independently, so some functionality may be at different stages of implementation for each language. To use the Azure AI Projects library in Python, you can use the pip package installation utility to install the Azure AI Projects package from PyPI. Copy. Pip install Azure AI Projects. Using the SDK to connect to a project. The first task in most Microsoft Foundry SDK code is to connect to a Microsoft Foundry project. Each project has a unique endpoint, which you can find on the project's overview page in the Microsoft Foundry portal. Note: the project provides multiple endpoints and keys, including an endpoint for the project itself, which can be used to access project connections, agents, and models in the Microsoft Foundry resource. An endpoint for Azure OpenAI Service APIs in the project's Microsoft Foundry resource. An endpoint for Foundry Tools APIs such as Azure Vision and Azure Language in the Microsoft Foundry resource. You can use the project endpoint in your code to create an AI project client object, which provides a programmatic proxy for the project, as shown in this Python example. Python. Copy. From Azure, identity import default Azure credential from Azure, AI to projects import AI project client. Project underscore point equals https:// project underscore client equals AI project client. Credential equals default Azure credential. Endpoint equals project underscore endpoint. Note: the code uses the default Azure credentials to authenticate when accessing the project. To enable this authentication, in addition to the Azure AI projects package, you need to install the Azure Identity package. Pip install Azure Identity. Tip: to access the project successfully, the code must be run in the context of an authenticated Azure session. For example, you could use the Azure command line interface, CLI, AZ login command to sign in before running the code. Next unit, work with project connections. Previous next. Need help? See our troubleshooting guide or work RK with project connections. 100 XP. 5 minutes. Each Microsoft Foundry project includes connected resources, which are defined both at the parent, Microsoft Foundry resource or hub level, and at the project level. Each resource is a connection to an external service, such as Azure Storage, Azure AI Search, Azure OpenAI, or another Microsoft Foundry resource. With the Microsoft Foundry SDK, you can connect to a project and retrieve connections, which you can then use to consume the connected services. For example, the AI project client object in Python has a connections property, which you can use to access the resource connections in the project. Methods of the connections object include connections.list returns a collection of connection objects, each representing a connection in the project. You can filter the results by specifying an optional connection underscore type parameter with a valid enumeration, such as connection type, Azure underscore open underscore AI. Connections get connection underscore name. Include underscore credentials returns a connection object for the connection with the name specified. If the include underscore credentials parameter is true, the default value, the credentials required to connect to the connection are returned, for example, in the form of an API key for a Foundry Tools resource. The connection objects returned by these methods include connection-specific properties, including credentials, which you can use to connect to the associated resource. The following code example lists all of the resource connections that have been added to a project. Python. Copy. From Azure, identity import default Azure credential from Azure. Create a chat client. 100 XP. 10 minutes. A common scenario in an AI application is to connect to a generative chat client. 100 XP. 10 minutes. A common scenario in an AI application is to connect to a generative AI model and use prompts to engage in a chat-based dialogue with it. While you can use the Azure OpenAI SDK to connect directly to a model using key-based or Microsoft Entra ID authentication, when your model is deployed in a Microsoft Foundry project, you can also use the Microsoft Foundry SDK to retrieve a project client, from which you can then get an authenticated OpenAI chat client for any models deployed in the project's Microsoft Foundry resource. This approach makes it easy to write code that consumes models deployed in your project, switching between them easily by changing the model deployment name parameter. Tip: you can use the OpenAI chat client provided by a Microsoft Foundry project to chat with any model deployed in the associated Microsoft Foundry resource, even non-OpenAI models, such as Microsoft Phi models. The following Python code sample uses the get_OpenAI_ client method to get an OpenAI client with which to chat with a model that has been deployed in the project's Microsoft Foundry resource. Python. Copy. From Azure, identity import default Azure credential from Azure. AI to projects import AI project client from OpenAI import Azure OpenAI try. Hashtag connect to the project underscore endpoint equals https:// Project underscore client equals AI project client. Credential equals default Azure credential. Endpoint equals project underscore endpoint. Hashtag get a chat client chat underscore client equals project underscore. Create a generative AI. Create a generative AI chat app. In this exercise, you use the Microsoft Foundry Python SDK to create a simple chat app that connects to a project and chats with a language model. Note: this exercise is based on pre-release SDK software, which may be subject to change. Where necessary, we've used specific versions of packages, which may not reflect the latest available versions. You may experience some unexpected behavior, warnings, or errors. While this exercise is based on the Foundry Python SDK, you can develop AI chat applications using multiple language-specific SDKs, including Azure AI projects for Python, Azure AI projects for Microsoft.NET, Azure AI projects for JavaScript. This exercise takes approximately 40 minutes. Deploy a model in a Foundry project. Let's start by deploying a model in a Foundry project. In a web browser, open the Foundry portal at https://a.azure.com and sign in using your Azure credentials. Close any tips or quick start panes that are open the first time you sign in, and if necessary, use the Foundry logo at the top left to navigate to the home page, which looks similar to the following image. Close the help pane if it's open. In the home page, in the Explore Models and Capabilities section, search for the GPT-4o model, which we'll use in our project. In the search results, select the GPT-4o model to see its details, and then at the top of the page for the model, select with the model. Summary. When prompted to create a project, enter a valid name for your project and expand advanced options. Select Customize and specify the following settings for your project. Foundry Resource, a valid name for your Foundry resource. Subscription, your Azure subscription. Resource Group, create or select a resource group. Region, select any AI Foundry recommended asterisk. Asterisk, some Azure AI resources are constrained by regional model quotas. In the event of a quota limit being exceeded later in the exercise, there's a possibility you may need to create another resource in a different region. Select Create and wait for your project, including the GPT-4o model deployment you selected, to be created. Important. Depending on your available quota for GPT-4o models, you might receive additional prompt to deploy the model to a resource in a different region. If this happens, do so using the default settings. Later in the exercise, you will not be able to use the default project endpoint. You must use the model-specific target URI. When your project is created, the chat playground will be opened automatically, so you can test your model. If not, in the task pane on the left, select Playgrounds and then open the chat playground. In the setup pane, note the name of your model deployment, which should be GPT-4o. You can confirm this by viewing the deployment in the Models and Endpoints page. Just open that page in the navigation pane on the left. Create a client application to chat with the model. Now that you have deployed a model, you can use the Foundry and Azure OpenAI SDKs to develop an application that chats with it. Prepare the application configuration. In the Foundry portal, view the overview page for your project. In the Endpoints and Keys area, ensure that the Foundry library is selected and view the Foundry project endpoint. You'll use this endpoint to connect to your project and model in a client application. Note: you can also use the Azure OpenAI endpoint. Open a new browser tab, keeping the Foundry portal open in the existing tab. Then in the new tab, browse to the Azure portal at https://portal.azure.com, signing in with your Azure credentials if prompted. Close any welcome notifications to see the Azure portal homepage. Use the underscore button to the right of the search bar at the top of the page to create a new Cloud Shell in the Azure portal, selecting a PowerShell environment with no storage in your subscription. The Cloud Shell provides a command line interface in a pane at the bottom of the Azure portal. You can resize or maximize this pane to make it easier to work in. Note: if you have previously created a Cloud Shell that uses a Bash environment, switch it to PowerShell. In the Cloud Shell toolbar, in the Settings menu, select Go to Classic version. This is required to use the code editor. Ensure you've switched to the classic version of the Cloud Shell before continuing. In the Cloud Shell pane, enter the following commands to clone the GitHub repo containing the code files for this exercise. Type the command, or copy it to the clipboard and then right-click in the command line and paste as plain text. Code. Copy. arms learn AI Foundry. fgit clone https://github.com/microsoft learning/mslearn-ai-studio learn AI Foundry. Tip: as you enter commands into the Cloud Shell, the output may take up a large amount of the screen buffer. You can clear the screen by entering the CLS command to make it easier to focus on each task. After the repo has been cloned, navigate to the folder containing the chat application code files and view them. Code. Copy. cd learn AI Foundry /lav files /chat app /python ls al. The folder contains a code file as well as a configuration file for application settings and a file defining the project runtime and package requirements. In the Cloud Shell command line pane, enter the following command to install the libraries you'll use. Code. Copy. Python /bin/bin/activate ps1 pip install. Our requirements: txt Azure Identity Azure AI projects OpenAI. Enter the following command to edit the configuration file that has been provided. Code. Copy. Code.env. The file is opened in a code editor. Important: if you deployed your GPT-4o model in the default region for your project, you can use the Foundry project or Azure OpenAI endpoint on the overview page for your project to connect to your model. If you had insufficient quota and deployed the model to another region, on the Models plus Endpoints page, select your model and use the target URI for your model. In the code file, replace the your_project_endpoint placeholder with the appropriate endpoint for your model and the your_model_deployment placeholder with the name assigned to your GPT-4o model deployment. After you've replaced the placeholders, within the code editor, use the Ctrl+S command or right-click Save to save your changes, and then use the Ctrl+Q command or right-click Quit to close the code editor while keeping the Cloud Shell command line open. Write code to connect to your project and chat with your model. Tip: as you add code, be sure to maintain the correct indentation. Enter the following command to edit the code file that has been provided. Code. Copy. Code chat-app.py. In the code file, note the existing statements that have been added at the top of the file to import the necessary SDK namespaces. Then, find the comment add references and add the following code to reference the namespaces in the libraries you installed previously. Code. Copy. Hashtag add references from Azure. Identity import default Azure credential from Azure. AI.projects import AI project client from OpenAI import Azure OpenAI. In the main function, under the comment get configuration settings, note that the code loads the project connection string and model deployment name values you defined in the configuration file. Find the comment initialize the project client and add the following code to connect to your Foundry project. Tip: be careful to maintain the correct indentation level for your code. Code. Copy. Hashtag initialize the project client project underscore client equals AI project client. Credential equals default Azure credential. Exclude underscore environment underscore credential equals true. Exclude underscore managed underscore identity underscore credential equals true. Endpoint equals project underscore. You use the Foundry SDK to create a client application for a generative AI model that you deployed in a Foundry project. Clean up. If you've finished exploring Foundry Portal, you should delete the resources you have created in this exercise to avoid incurring unnecessary Azure costs. Open the Azure portal and view the contents of the resource group where you deployed the resources used in this exercise. On the toolbar, select Delete Resource Group. Enter the resource group name and confirm that you want to delete it. Copyright 2025 Microsoft Privacy Consumer Health Privacy Terms of Use Trademark Source.